The theme for today's meeting is data strategy and data management planning. I've heard about data management planning in the earth science community for a long time with regards to project level data management planning. And so what you would typically have is a proposal. In the proposal, there might be a requirement from NSF or whoever to submit a data management plan. And that basically puts on paper, there are a few elements that you would want to have, like how the project management will occur with the data during the course of the project, how you'll deal with, you might have some IT speak, but generally it's not very technical. And then you have often what you'll plan to do with the data afterwards. So, finding the appropriate repositories and specifying those up front, and any associated metadata or whatnot. So it's like a promise you put up front in your project proposal. And really that's just a small part of data management planning. So I feel like this is a big gap for the earth science community, and it's not the ideal by any means. What we should be doing is looking at the strategy. Where are we as a community? Where do we need to go in terms of our data strategy? Do we want to build out certain repositories that could be shared? And it's often discussed in a corporate setting. So you'll have, a CEO that comes in and decides they have a 5-year plan they want to get on top of a certain business area. And often that involves putting together a data warehouse around that information need. And so that would be a data strategy. And certainly we have data centers and repositories that are topically focused. And so you might consider there's data strategy in a diffuse way, but not really until recently has there been very explicit data strategy as the topic of these discussions. And so I'll present one example, the federal data strategy that's come out recently, June 6th, I believe. And that's been in the works for a while, but that's crossed the federal government. I also want to touch on some other federal mandates that are particularly topical right now. That's like changes that are happening as priorities of the administrations are changing. And then I want to tie this back to the Arctic Data Collaboration Team. And something that I've talked to Peter and Sarah about doing, maybe coming up with our own roadmap, if you will, because IARPC already has strategy. We're not trying to reproduce that, but we're coming up with a roadmap, if you will, for the team. And that could also inform our next year work plan. So, I guess what I'd like to do first, maybe discuss a little more on data strategy. But since it's a small group, let's see, we have, I invite anybody, let me know, did I say anything that's wrong? Like, are you aware of data strategy that's, in your organization that you are developing or following, or in the broader federal community, and above this project level data management planning? And please correct me, feel free to jump in. I like this to be an interactive discussion.
Hi, this is Ruth. This is not a correction. It's just a question. So are you aware of the work on data management planning being done in the Research Data Alliance? Which is certainly not US federal, but more global.
Right. The research data, RDA?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not. So, okay, they're definitely connected to the earth sciences community. And
Yeah. They're working on taking data management planning to the next level, like you're suggesting is needed. Um, they call it active data management plans, where it's all coordinated and it's not something you do just at the beginning, but something that is updated continually through the life of a project,
mhm.
and defining mechanisms to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd say like the kinds of big thinking around data management planning has been to catalog plans, to manage them in a life cycle. So they, uh, you write your plan at the beginning, it can be revised, and then it's finalized and then archived. So treating the plan itself as a management tool. And those, that's all well and good. But I think those still kind of are limited to project level data management. And in order to really support, you know, large scale science, community or data driven science, you need to have coordination of the data management activities at a much higher level. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I don't know, the level of data management strategy that, you know, that's occurred in the past, or maybe it hasn't. And we agencies pursue our missions and develop data and capacity commensurate to our needs. But as a community, have we really thought through what we need to do in order to meet our long-term objectives and plans?
I suspect you're right on that. And I know in particular, there are some agencies that don't believe they have a long-term mandate to keep their information available, particularly purely research ones.
We won't name names, right?
Exactly. Which causes problems for science, as you might expect, if the underpinning data is not available for reuse or any kind of validation.
Right. Colleen, I'm going to call on you because I want to encourage participation. You're in the Arctic group at NSF. You guys must have some sort of data management strategy, don't you?
Yeah, I also see that Peter has his hand up too, so he might want to chime in.
You go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, so I'm not sure which federal agencies Ruth was alluding to, but I can probably guess. I think, the Arctic section here at NSF has the Arctic Data Center, which is a pretty substantial investment in data management for data produced by, projects that are funded by the Arctic section. And that's unique at NSF. Most other divisions and directorates and programs don't have that. And they're operating more on an ad hoc basis. There is some planning going here and there, but I would say overarching at NSF, I think it's more kind of bottom up from the program level.
Okay. And Peter, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just think you really hit a fundamental challenge and opportunity here, based at least on my experience with this group and with other groups, is this need to have that higher level strategy, but a lack of clarity on who it is that leads that or sort of coordinates it. So on the one hand, you do have a group like IARPC, which the reason I got engaged was it seems to me like a really great group to do that, because it is multi-agency, including NSF. But we also have a lot of activity that goes on sort of at different scales, including with research, with communities. and so on. So we end up, and Sarah brought this up right at the beginning of this call, because data crosses all of the boundaries across disciplines and domains and so on. There's no sort of place that says, yeah, this group should do it, and they should be the ones that are doing it, at least independently of others. So the challenge is, I think, yeah, how do we connect all of these things? And the real thing here is, at some level, is resources. And also, given that the research community doesn't actually answer to a federal agency, they sort of have their own things going on, how do we work through that? So I think, there's progress being made, but that's probably what you're going to see, because even at the level of these various organizations that we've been organizing, you're now seeing spin-off organizations. So these various committees are now having subcommittees form, but the subcommittees are forming subcommittees, and they're all off doing things that are actually strategic. How to make sure they work together. So.
Jonathan, can I jump in here? This is Sarah. So often when we get into data, because I'm not a data person, I'm within 2 minutes of the webinar, I'm lost because I don't understand. But this is more theoretical and big picture, and so I get it. And so I'm kind of excited about this conversation. So I'm just going to walk back 8 years when we did the first plan, the first IARPIC plan. And we had these, we called them, we didn't call them collaboration teams, we called them something else. A number of them took as a first step kind of trying to get a landscape of what is being funded, what is being done. So there was a really nice spreadsheet of all the modeling efforts that were being funded by federal agencies. And then there was one on sea ice that they actually updated many times over a 3 or 4 year period. And those are all archived on the website, so I can pull them up and send them to you. But I'm wondering, has anybody done a landscape of data strategies by federal agency? I mean, do we know where they exist and what they say, and are they comparable? I don't know. So I'm just throwing that out there.
Right. I don't know that, like I said, that there's this data management planning, but very little is done at the higher level in a public way. So plans for projects might be posted online, but the what went in, the thinking that went into developing the plan template, if you will, the programs that are supporting the projects that get funded, that's opaque, that's behind the scenes. And it's not to say this stuff isn't happening, but there is definitely a lack of transparency on that, how this works. And part of the thought of having a strategy is having actually something people can read and think about and share outside of the borders of your individual agency, so you can come to terms and agree to do something together. So I'm looking at this letter. I guess it was, go ahead. I need to find some way to zoom in on this.
Yeah, so Colleen, thanks. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So would this is NSF's, but does something like this exist at NASA and other agencies? And is it even helpful to have all these, in a spreadsheet that people could identify? Would it be helpful to know what the landscape is? And I get, and this gets at Ruth's earlier comment, that this is just federal, this is just US federal, but that's the space that IARPIC operates in. And I always keep going back to Peter's comment when he first started doing this. Wouldn't it be ideal if IARPIC collaborations, if this team could be the nexus of where we bring these kinds of information together, so that it's one-stop shopping for somebody who's trying to understand what that strategy is and what the programs are.
Sarah, I think that would be a great idea. Also, just from kind of a federal perspective, to kind of get an idea of what other agencies are doing, because this is not an easy problem to solve moving forward. It would be interesting to kind of, you know, see this, what other agencies are doing, how they're trying to move forward with this. You know, this is kind of one approach at an NSF wide level, but I would be fascinated to see kind of what, you know, NASA is doing, and having that in one place as a resource.
Yeah, I think this is a slightly different topic, and maybe we'll table this for this more broad policy questions. Table it for another meeting, because strategy is really a different thing. Okay.
Jonathan, I agree strategy is a different thing, but I do think that understanding the landscape within which the strategy has to operate is useful, and I can see why IARPC and Colleen, for example, would like to have such a thing. The question is,
okay,
is there any other group that could do it? And I suspect the answer is no.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's certainly a part. So I'm thinking of excuse me if I'm throwing out acronyms and I can't back them up with what they actually mean. The CMMI, this is a group that is kind of like a nonprofit that provides data management best practices. It's some community for something. They've developed this data maturity matrix, and in it they have all the functional, all the areas where you can rate maturity of an organization. And data strategy is one. Data governance is different, and data policy kind of falls into the governance part, not the strategy. So people who think about this topic theoretically have, with experience from the private sector, from the defense agencies who are way far ahead on these practices than we are, because they have greater investment, and it's more critical to their missions that they're saving lives and whatnot. So it's a big payoff for data management. They've actually, I wish I could show that figure right now, the data maturity matrix in the different functional areas. So I guess what I would like to do is try to inject, oh yeah, you can Google it. It looks like a circle. Well, there's CMMI, and I still can't tell what that stands for. And they're not going to have this diagram right on the front page. Oh, here we go. Here are the areas. Data strategies here on the left, and that's what it includes. And then the policy piece, I guess, would go under data governance. But I don't see it specifically any mention of policy, just what's on this page. Because who decides on policy? Those who govern the data and those who govern the organization. So data strategy is a bit of a different beast. It's like data strategy are the people who have the most practical experience and knowledge on how to do things, and they're coming up with, like a path forward, a strategy, looking into the future. Data governance is more like day-to-day. Oh, we have this problem. There's a crisis, or we want to avoid some sort of errors that would be detrimental to the organization. So they're in a very different functional area for data management. And not to put a too fine point on it, these are all important areas to discuss, and maybe focusing on data governance at our next meeting would be appropriate. So I just want to move on here to along the agenda. the way that data management strategy could proceed for IARPIC, for this team, the guide for us, often we don't have to come up with it ourselves. We can draw upon existing data strategy that exists in the federal community. So that's why I've pulled or presented on, I'm not seeing Kelly's screen. Is that because of me, or? Yeah, let's look at that link for the data management strategy, the federal data strategy. Oh yeah, here's a memo. So this whole website is devoted to the federal data strategy. But here's the memo from June 4th. This has been a long time coming. We heard about this several months ago, and this website's been up and live, and they've been putting out this content and material for us to review. So, but unfortunately, I'm not sure that people have been aware of this. So now the federal data strategy is official. I think it's like an executive order or something. And here's the link if you can't see it on the shared screen. So this takes a much more holistic view. This is not earth science people working on this data strategy. This is looking at across the board best, this data strategy approach for the federal government, and it highlights to me areas that we have not been effective in the earth science community at developing data strategy. There's a lot of things in here. Maybe if you just scroll down a page, beyond the purpose, and just look at the heading level. Well, this reads like a policy. Here are the principles. Principles are also on the website, but okay, ethical governance, conscious design, learning culture. And there's one last one I can't see. Oh, maybe that was it. Okay, and then there's these practices. And these are not at all what we would have put forward for our data strategy, I think, if we, tried to embark upon this. But it actually quite makes sense, and I think it's something we can learn from if we really take a fresh look at this and try to build from this existing data strategy, and then there's an associated action plan. Now, the action plan is coming to each of the agencies as a OMB directive. So you guys, depending on whether you are in a federal agency and what position you're in, you might never be affected by this. But once again, I ask you to scroll down. It has like a 12 or 20 steps, things that we have to do in the next year. We're going to create this data council at DOI that involves, to support the council, we're creating a data governance board. We've been planning for many years, but it finally got off the ground. There's actually, so credentialing, so there's a lot about workforce development in here. There's going to be a later one on training. This data ethics is really interesting to me, and it's not a term that we hear too much about in earth sciences, though maybe we should, and we should be thinking about it. Data protection. So for data protection, often they're talking about microdata, and not necessarily, some of us might be dealing with it, but not necessarily something we deal with a lot in the earth sciences. And so data protection, data repository, one stop. So these are all, take a look at these. These are proposed actions. And like I said, whether or not they affect you, I think even as a member of the public, you have an outlet here in order to respond to these. Maybe you don't have anything to say. Maybe they all look good to you. But if you take strong issue with anything, don't feel prohibited from responding on the website, sending your comments in. And what I've heard is the federal data strategy changed a lot from what was initially proposed on the website to its final version that was issued with that memo. So here's a real opportunity, and I think coming from the perspective of the Arctic community, people might have a unique point of view and could bring up really interesting challenges to some of these issues. I can't think of one myself, and we've already done our data collection as part of our department and submitted our feedback. So I won't personally be responding to this separately, but this is coming down the pike and is going to keep me busy for the next 2 or 3 years. All of these things in this action plan. It's in 2014 we had the open data policy, and this is the next thing. This is this is actually going to be a lot more work for me than that ever was, because there's some real heavy lifts here. And there is a progression. I don't think that, it's not to denigrate the open data policy. That was good for its time. But this is the next best thing, and I think it'll move us forward as a federal body of federal agencies. So as much as possible, I would like to tear off of this strategy when we're talking about data strategy and take it seriously. Even though it's not earth science, we shouldn't ignore some of the things in here, like the data ethics brings up really interesting questions for the earth sciences. And for example, underrepresented communities, maybe the way that the information is being collected in the environment and how it affects certain communities in the Arctic. Who knows? The decisions that are made at a federal level affect people on the ground, and vice versa. So we've got some gaps in our approach to data management as a federal community, and here's an opportunity to address some of those. Okay, I will open it up for some discussion. I know I didn't get into very much detail on these, but the materials are on the web and available for you to review if you're interested. There are 3 chats. I don't know if they're from before.
So I'll jump in here and say thanks a ton for sharing this. And I wasn't aware of it, and I certainly would encourage you to post it on the website so people are aware of this. And I get that it's way beyond geosciences, Arctic. I get that, but I'm just curious. So there are a lot of agency activities, like at least 4 or 5 responsibilities in that implementation plan that agencies have to take. And so are agencies forming committee? It looks like they have to form a committee and do something. And Colleen, I guess I want to throw this out at you. Are you familiar with this? And do you know how NSF is addressing this?
Yeah, I actually haven't seen this, and I just thought we were told to get rid of a bunch of committees too, right? So the thing, when I was I haven't looked through this carefully, obviously, but when you were reviewing it, Jonathan, I was immediately thinking whoa, this is way above my pay grade. Essentially the response to this from NSF will probably come from the office of the director, and they'll probably put together a very high level committee and figure out how to move forward in response to the memo. That will probably have impacts on how we deal with our data, but that's pretty far down the line. But I'm not going to see any at the program level, we're not going to see any immediate effects. That's what my guess would be.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll jump in as well, just with some thinking. One is that I'm really happy that you're on board, Jonathan, because this is why for a while we've been thinking how important it is to have feds in leadership roles in IARPC, because you can bring new content, ideas, etc. In sort of very quickly skimming through the action plan as well, I'm looking at this going, wow, this is actually really interesting and exciting. But it also makes me think maybe this is a good opportunity for IARPC in particular, because when I look at a number of these things, I think, wow, this stuff is happening outside of the federal family, if you will, or not necessarily outside, but not led by, through the groups we've talked about, RDA, AGU, ESIP, and so on. And then I see some of these things that they're saying, put together, basically a federated search, but through data.gov. And we have that sort of thing going on that's happening and is getting funded by NSF and other groups. Maybe here's an opportunity to have a series of meetings, calls, whatever, to start thinking about how we stitch not only this together amongst the feds, but also with the broader research community that are maybe funded by the feds but aren't feds. Because in a way, I could see this setting up two parallel systems going forward.
Yeah, and I like the word parallel. The way I think about these things is, because it's very true what Colleen said, that it needs, this is going to come from OMB. It has to be disseminated, or I think the word's delegated. Anyways, somehow that has to be translated into the agency speak, and an agency memo has to be written, and then the programs will then take their first look at this and decide what to do. So there's many levels in the federal government. I guess what I'm pointing out is the data strategy is based on best practices, and what fundamentally we're going to be following the same best practices, regardless of when we receive that memo, and particularly how they want us to implement it. So it behooves us to take a look at this early stage and to start swimming in the right direction, so that when that memo arrives at our desk, we're not taken off guard and we don't feel like we're being jerked in the opposite direction. We're already going the right way. We might have to, fine tune it, but we'll all be swimming as a community in the same direction. I think.
Hi, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I think you're bringing this up is a very important thing to do. I do note that the comments are due by July 5th. And I actually think that this committee, or maybe IARPC as a whole, ought to be submitting comments on behalf of the Arctic. Now, that's a little bit too close a deadline for that to be really probably done. But I've decided I'm going to take a look and put comments in if I see any.
That's individuals. That's where it stands. I can't do it, in my official capacity because I had that opportunity already. But I don't know. I appreciate, Ruth, you taking that upon yourself. If you can look at this. We obviously don't have time on this call to really discuss this in any detail. So I'll post it on IARPC and encourage people to take some time and respond individually.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I think I agree with Ruth. It's the July 5 deadline makes it impossible to try and get a consensus response on this. But I do think having Jonathan having pointed this out to us, and that this is going to go forward, and it is going to impact us. And I like your analogy of, let's all swim in more or less the right direction. I think there's work that IARPIC can do even beyond the July 5 deadline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is just the beginning. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit. There are two more topics, and I might just briefly cover the second one so we can get on to our roadmap discussion. And it's the I just wanted to reference these other federal mandates and legislation that have occurred recently, that have come to pass. This one we call the Evidence Act, which has a long name that I won't repeat here, but embedded in it, there is something like an open data policy in it. So, some version of open data policy has been codified in law as part of this broader legislation that was passed in January of this year. And that has, will have a huge impact to the federal agencies. Although these things are cumulative, like I've been saying, as is this Geospatial Data Act that came a little earlier last year. And but we've had geospatial data acts of one form or another for decades. So this is also cumulative. Something that's a little of, I'd say it's a bit of a bigger shift is this improving IQA. IQA stands for Information Quality Act. It's a memo from OMB. And the reason why this is a bit of a different beast is because it'll have a little more significant impacts to the way agencies disseminate their science. So I'm not talking about data here. This is really science writ large, and agencies really deal with scientific information, not the sciences themselves. With a few exceptions like USGS, who have in-house scientists. This will affect the federal government writ large, the way that we participate in science and science dissemination. And underpinning it is making things like computer code available for people to be able to reproduce. That, as far as I know, has never been required before. Providing access to all the supporting data and information to a decision in a public way so people can scrutinize it. And we're dealing with this memo right now in our agency and looking at it at a very high level, science advisors from their point of view, trying to interpret it and give feedback to OMB, quite frankly, on what this means. And within the department, we've had a series of directives that have been along the same lines. To my point of view, all pushing a data agenda forward, you could see the half empty or half full. I think this is definitely a half full moment where we can take advantage of all these new legislation and mandates to move a data agenda forward. And so the federal data strategy is piggybacking on these mandates. So it's kind of bring these together into a cohesive framework so we can understand how to move the federal government forward. And that's the connection to data strategy. So I just wanted to cover that briefly. Do you guys have any thoughts or discussion on this point, the recent mandates?
Just one question. Would it be possible to get links to what those are?
Sure. Yeah, I think I can come up with those pretty quick. I didn't put them in the, I might have had them in that Word document. Let me see. No, that's a good point, because these are kind of like the terms we use in-house. Evidence Act is Foundations for Evidence-Based Decision-Making. Geospatial Data Act might actually be called that. The memo, I wonder if that's even public yet. I'm not sure that's in some sort of form of revision or review, but I'll look for a link for that. And these departmental directives, I don't know if I can share those except what's available on our website. So I'll see what I can find.
Okay, thank you. That would save some searching.
Right, okay.
I can post them in the comments. That way it'll be easy for you guys to find it.
Okay, yeah. If you happen to see them while you're surfing there. Okay, so last topic. Okay, so and I'm glad Peter and Sarah are here to guide me in this topic, the ADCT roadmap, because this is a concept that they brought up to me. And so this agenda was built around, hey, here's the background we need to be able to develop our roadmap. And of course, there's existing activities we have to recognize as part of the roadmap. So this isn't to say that this is the only background we need, but let's look at this roadmap in this fresh new light, these new mandates, this data strategy, and see if we can craft something that recognizes all the capacity and contributions we have to make, and also gives us a step forward towards some of our, as far as I understand, they should specifically speak to each of the teams. What are the strategic elements? What are they called?
Performance elements.
Performance elements, yeah. So I'm looking at here, and there's the first 9.4.1. This is the inventories, advanced system models of U.S. observing inventories and data centers to further understanding of these capacities. Okay. 9.4.2, interoperable Arctic data sharing system. 9.4.3. So clearly I'm still becoming familiar with these, but like I said, the roadmap will tell us how we're going to achieve these objectives, and also they should link to these other mandates and strategy. That's what I would add to that discussion. And I don't know, it's an idea that I'm serving out there. So Peter and Sarah, please, let me know, what do you think about that approach?
Well, maybe just a couple of quick points. One is for those who may go and look at these, this is getting to be a dated document now that Sandy and I and others worked on with Sarah, 2015-ish. So there are some specific projects and programs in there that may or may not be active, or they may have changed how they're active. So don't get too hung up on those specifics. I think I would suggest focusing on the higher level things like how do we, enable interoperability and, promote various things. And then if you think about it that way, interoperability is a good blanket term in a way, because if you look at that implementation plan you put up, a lot of those things intersect. You're not going to have an interoperable system if you don't have an ethics strategy for sensitive data. You're not going to have interoperability if you don't have, a federated search and so on and so forth, or at least at the level we're talking about, at the scale we're talking about. So that's where the idea initially came from, is I think the last few years, we've been really getting together as a community, and we're talking about a lot of different things, and we've been talking about specific projects, but it fits with the idea that we don't have a larger sort of map or strategy around that. And now I think IARPIC's mature enough, and our community and IARPIC, and then beyond it, is getting more and more mature. So I think we're in a position now where we can start saying this is, where we want to go without being too prescriptive because of the limits that we have on not being able to, establish policy and things like that.
So I have a question, and I know, Jonathan, you put this out for me to respond to, but I have a question, and that is, when I think about how other teams and the EI teams are so different from a thematic team, right? And because you can go down a rabbit hole and look at data from only one perspective, right? Say, community-based observing or sea ice data or whatever, and use that as maybe a model for how other communities might do data management, or you can take kind of a broader view and say, okay, we're going to look at data, and the only constraint on that is that it's Arctic research data. Other than that, it's an open platform. So, and I think that often in IARPC, what happens with data, what happens with modeling, and what happens less so with observing is that they get drawn into the activities of other teams and kind of go down these rabbit holes that are very specific to a type of Arctic data. And so when I think about a roadmap for this team, it seems to me that what might be effective, and this is my question, is are there one or two or three themes that are overarching across all these different elements of Arctic research data that make sense, that are mature enough, and that we have enough people to do the heavy lift on them to address? And if there are 2, 3 of these themes, can you create a roadmap to how you're going to address them and how you're going to bring those communities together around those themes to get to an end goal? So I guess that's my question. Are you looking at this from a thematic perspective, or you rather would you like to stay in that space where we use sea ice as an example?
I don't know. I think the team can be effective if it provides some leadership and helps affect change. So change for the better, obviously. So at the very least, what I'd like to see happen is for the Arctic to be in the lead with the implementation of these best practices, because maybe just by sharing this information and getting people on board with these best practices, that they would, in their own frameworks or contexts, be able to be more effective and implement a better Arctic program. I think we have to look for, on the ground change. That's what I would measure against. So thematically, that's one way to do it. You can, narrowly focus on something. You can look broadly across data. I think what we there is that problem that you get relegated to these extremes, because that's where you tend to be able to make progress. But it's really in the middle where you need to be effective. So you can feel like you're making progress, but really you step back or look at it from another point of view and you haven't. So one thing I mentioned earlier is we are doing data management at a project level. What we really have to, and if we're not doing this already, I think we should be looking at how we define the community and working at higher levels of organization. And that's how I would summarize it. If we can do that, We will improve our data management maturity as a community. We'll be at least following the same best practices and doing things a little more consistently. And I'm not under any delusion that now all of a sudden all of our data is going to be interoperable and we'll have all these great tools. I don't think that's going to happen by taking this approach. But if we can look across the board and elevate everybody's maturity to thinking more collaboratively between agencies, I think that brings the community to a better place, and it helps to address some of these other goals across the IARCUS.
Sounds good. We're just about 2 minutes from the top of the hour. So I'd like to invite any last minute comments, and then I think we should probably wrap it up.
All right, well, thanks you guys for a good discussion. And